I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about the only aspect of this game that really matters. It's time to look at the bosses of Dark Souls 3 and rank them from worst to best. Today's video will focus on bosses 25 through 13, with my next video tackling my top 12. If you're watching this after that video is out, a link will be in the description so you can head there and continue the fun, or you can click the card that appears in the top right corner. From Software are truly masters of their craft. As with each progressive game, their bosses continue to improve. Flashier movesets, more intriguing designs, and a willingness to still take risks that sometimes pays off. For Dark Souls 3, this mentality created a game that is primarily known for the quality of a majority of its boss fights. And look, I'm no different from the fanbase at large. I think Dark Souls 3 has the most consistent set of boss fights in Soulsborne, and I am so excited to gush about them. So let's not waste any time, my top 25 Dark Souls 3 bosses ranked. And be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you watched my Dark Souls 3 area ranking videos, link in the top right corner, you've already heard me air my grievances about the Ancient Wyvern in Archdragon Peak, and now I get to do it again. There are moments in Soulsborne games where you can tell a boss was added to pad the runtime, give an extra boss so the final number will look more impressive. The Ancient Wyvern personifies this concept, and pairs it with a hint of longing and regret. You see, when you enter the boss arena and the magnificent beast flies down, your blood is pumping. You found this entirely optional area, and here they are immediately throwing a wyvern at you. It's so disappointing then when you realize that the boss isn't really a boss, but an extended level hazard with a health bar. The gimmick of the fight is that you don't actually attack the boss, instead running to its left and having to make your way through an enemy gauntlet of man-serpents, eventually finding a ladder leading up to some wooden rafters where you can drop onto a bridge above the wyvern, do a plunging attack, bish bash bosh. In other words, the Ancient Wyvern serves no real purpose as a boss fight, given you'll die more to the regular enemies on your path than the actual attacks from the creature with the giant fucking health bar at the bottom of the screen. The focus is placed on navigation as opposed to combat, which is fine, had it been similar to the Dragon God in Demon Souls, where you need to navigate the arena, do a plunging attack to weaken the boss, but then you're able to damage the boss in a regular fight. That could have been fun, and it could have redeemed the sins of both the Dragon God and this fight. Instead, it dies with a whimper, and that's if the plunging attack decides it feels like working. I've seen clips of people that have had their plunging thrusts glitch out or miss for no reason. But the fight itself isn't what bothers me, it's the fact that placing the Ancient Wyvern here completely screws the pacing of Archdragon Peak. When you beat the boss, you obtain a bonfire, and this bonfire becomes your new checkpoint. Yet moments after, you find an elevator leading back down to the original bonfire of Archdragon Peak. Clearly the elevator was meant to be a shortcut to the upper temple, but the only reason you would use that shortcut is if the original bonfire was the only one you got in early Archdragon Peak. By adding the Ancient Wyvern bonfire, you completely ruin that little bit of level design. Beyond that, the Ancient Wyvern arena would have worked fine as a non-boss area, as there already are a few optional side paths and items to find. You can just tell the boss wasn't planned, and given later in the level you fight another wyvern, but this one can be killed for some reason, the tonal whiplash is insane. Not even Dark Souls 3's stellar soundtrack can save this fight from obscurity when it's one of the least listened to tracks on the OST, and most of the YouTube videos playing the theme have barely any comments, not even hate comments about the fight. This is a level hazard, not a boss, and that's why it's at the bottom of my list. If you had to bet money on the most forgettable boss in Dark Souls 3, There are a couple that come to mind, and for me, that title goes to the optional DLC fight of the Champion's Gravetender and Gravetender Great Wolf. The only reason this boss exists is to give players the Champion's Bones item upon its defeat, which allows players to access the special Hollow Arena feature of Dark Souls 3. This was the PvP DLC edition, and man, they couldn't have locked it behind something a bit cooler. After all, the arena you fight this boss in is absolutely stunning. The ice-cold flower field leading to the underside of Crossbreed Priscilla's tower, the glacial walls making up the chasm this place sits below, and yet we're then met with an NPC and his 3 doggos. I thought we were past the point of chucking regular enemies at a player during the boss fights, much less 3 wolves who have the same tracking and skills as Soulsborne dogs, one of the most hated enemy types. Obviously this is to stop the players from absolutely decimating the Gravetender in a few hits, but look, this playthrough, I didn't care. He does wield a new weapon, the Valor Heart, but I barely hear anybody mention it, so I have no idea if it's good. Feels like a PvP weapon with the tiny sword and shield. He also has the same weaknesses of any NPC, except that when he reaches low health, he summons his buddy, the Gravetender Great Wolf. The irony is, if you're remotely good at this game, you should already be able to melt this man's health bar before the Great Wolf gets there, meaning you never have to actually fight the 2 bosses at once. And if you've explored the Ariandel DLC, the Great Wolf isn't going to be a new experience. It's just the giant wolf you encountered in the snowfield, but now it has a full health bar and you can actually kill it. A very budget Great Grey Wolf Sith with the charge attacks of Vort of the Boreal Valley. The only reason this boss will kill you is because it's an aggressive dog, but if you do decent damage, you shouldn't struggle. Which is a shame because, and the reason why this boss is so low, it's a paid boss. This is DLC content. The Ashes of Ariandel DLC was already critiqued by the fanbase for being a bit too short, and having a boss that is an NPC and a rematch with an enemy from earlier in the DLC just screams of, not laziness, but a lack of creativity. It's a letdown of a fight, but it doesn't just let me down, it lets down the fantastic arena, and it lets down the amazing boss music accompanying it. Yuka Kitamura is a talented composer, and she didn't have to go so hard on this theme for such a lackluster boss. But you know what? That OST kept it out of last place. Never say I don't take soundtrack into account. I remember when Dark Souls 3 was in its press cycle before release, and one of the main bosses they decided to show off was the curse-rotted Great Wood. And at the time, it seemed so cool. A gigantic tree monster who, after a certain amount of damage was done, could break the ground, sending us flying into this rotten pit arena. How cool was that? As it turns out, not very. The Curse-Rotted Greatwood is widely considered to be one of the worst bosses in the game, and I get it. It's fun for a first-time playthrough, especially if you're going in blind, as you need to figure out that the pustules around its body are its weak spots. And then once the arena shatters and you drop down into the depths and a giant fucking hand comes out of its unmentionables, that imagery will stay with you for a long time. Yet once you've beaten the boss and figured out the puzzle, so to speak, future runs of the fight feel more like a chore than a duel. Because despite being an optional boss, it drops the transposing kiln used to transpose boss souls, which basically makes it mandatory for anyone looking to have fun with this game's best weapons and equipment. In my footage playthrough, I breezed through this boss, destroying those eggs without really needing to think. My brain was turned off, which is never something I want going into a Soulsborne fight. I like to be engaged, I want to feel like I'm in some semblance of danger. The Curse-Rotted Greatwood just doesn't give that vibe. The music is a creepy banger though. I love the part where the theme goes eeeeh, which also happens to be the entire track. Mutoi Sakuraba, the composer of Dark Souls 1, as well as my JRPG baby Golden Sun, worked on some of the tracks to Dark Souls 3, including this one, so shout out to him. The irony is that had this fight taken me much longer in my footage playthrough, I'd have bumped it down to the very bottom of the list, but the fact I can get through it quick enough now, and it does have some merit as a Demon Souls puzzle style boss for new players, keeps it from true tragedy. Another boss that isn't beloved by the fanbase but is honestly pretty inoffensive. Let's go to church and chill with the Deacons of the Deep. I couldn't help it, guys. The Adele pun was just too strong in that case. The Deacons are the bosses of the Cathedral of the Deep, and they act as an accurate representation of what fanatical religion does to a person. Wholly devoted to their gooey god, and more than willing to sacrifice you for their lord. But you'll be the one mowing them down instead. The gimmick of this fight is that the soul of the Deacon inhabits one of the enemies, and you have to kill that glowing enemy to damage the soul. Once the enemy dies, the soul goes to a different opponent and the fight continues. This first phase is generally pretty simple. You need to know how to crowd control, a vital skill if you want to survive in Soulsborne. Knowing when to rush in and get those attacks off, when to back off and heal, when you can afford to take some damage and be a little reckless, you know? After a certain amount of time has passed, the true owner of the Deacon's soul appears, Archdeacon Royce, and his vanguard besties. While still not a difficult fight, as you can stunlock a majority of the enemies here, there are a few new attacks to watch out for. The Deep Soul attack that fires dark soul dregs in your direction with a slight tracking ability, and more dangerously, a long build-up spell that can cover the arena in a curse-inflicting fog. This can be cancelled by killing the Archdeacon Vanguard enemies, and should be a priority. Aside from that, just avoid the normal fireball attacks, and the Deacons will go down relatively easily. There's something very atmospheric about this fight that really elevates it for me, even if gameplay-wise, it's not that exciting. The setting and arena of this gigantic coffin, the candles and religious symbols littered across the walls and ceilings, and that music, oh my god! Nobuyoshi Suzuki, who you may know from his work designing the Japanese lyrics to Jump Up Superstar from Mario Odyssey, composed one boss track for Dark Souls 3. Guess which one he composed? Deacons of the Deep. And there is something so sacrilegious in the best way about this track. I won't pretend to be a musical composer, I'm talking out of my ass here, but the church choir and that ominous organ music, combined with Dark Souls 3's already somber tone, creates this foreboding experience that reminds me of Hellfire from Hunchback of Notre Dame. This song screams inferno, it screams eternal suffering in hell, and feels like it could be besties with Lawrence the First Vicar's theme from Bloodborne, so Nobuyoshi, well done. Yeah, this next one is a biased low pick for me. Rounding out my bottom 5 is Osiros, the Consumed King, a late game battle at the back of his lovely sludge-covered garden. I'm gonna get the positives out of the way first. His OST, composed by Yuka Kitamura, is perfect for the fight, with the first half feeling like your typical magical mage theme, which fits his Phase 1 moveset. But once he enrages and becomes a completely physical beast, the music reflects this and becomes bombastic and aggressive, complemented by his absolutely bestial shrieks and screams. One of the more underrated music tracks in the game for sure. And the storytelling of the fight is fun too. Osiros has an invisible baby, Ocelot, and he is consumed by paranoia that everyone wants to take away his baby. The irony being that not a single relevant character gives a damn about him, his invisible baby, or his lore. And that kind of goes for the player too, especially me. I know he's got stuff going on, but TLDR, I don't need his drama. I'm trying to link the first flame dragon, fucker. The way his fight starts off, his sanity remains, and he uses intelligent and calculated attacks, including magic. I had high hopes that this fight would really tap into what a magic user can be in a boss fight, as FromSoft at that point were incredibly hit or miss when it comes to that style of battle. So you can imagine my disappointment when he hits his second phase, loses his invisible baby, and just becomes a more aggressive Vort of the Boreal Valley, going full quadrupedal to lunge and swipe with his claws, fang, and tail across the arena. I find the second phase quite difficult actually, I won't lie, but not in a fun way. I feel like when I take damage, some of it is justified, but other times I feel like the hitboxes are a little wonky, or the frenetic, frantic nature of his attacks just feel a bit too tough to dodge at times. It's not like Orphan of Kos, another infamous ferocious boss that balanced the fine line between being aggressive and giving the player opportunities. With Osiris, it feels like luck whether you get a good run or not once the second phase hits. Though I do appreciate that his fight is a clear reference to Seath the Scaleless, and he provides a moveset that you could imagine Seath using in Dark Souls 1 if he wasn't so immobile. I'm more like Osiris for his lore than his actual battle, and even though he may technically be better than a few of the fights coming up, personal preference comes into play. I just like them more. But I totally understand if someone might rank this fight higher, because it does combine a lot of fun aspects with lore, battle, music, etc. It's just not my cup of tea. If I could just have a quick moment of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023 on this channel, and you can help. Over 60% of you aren't subscribed, and I think we should rectify that. So parry that subscribe button, and be sure to stay tuned for more Soulsborne content every single Wednesday. Back to the video. So, I have a soft spot for High Lord Wolnir. Is he an easy fight? Yes. Is he a bit underwhelming? Yes. But does he have a goofy little skeleton face and a fun jump scare at the start of his fight for new players? Hell yes! For the boss of the Catacombs, I don't know what I was expecting, but a giant skeleton lord trying to climb his way out of the abyss, only held up by the 3 glowing rings on his arms, certainly wasn't on my bingo card, but it makes for a fun little gimmick fight. Your goal is to destroy the 3 rings, doing enough damage to shatter each one. On a first playthrough, you might play passive with this fight and not feel confident striking the rings, which is the main reason you might struggle here. If you give Wolnir a chance to climb towards you, he can be an aggressive and oppressive foe, especially if he corners you at the wall of the arena, which is effectively your lose state. You see, his main danger is his addiction to being the Vape Lord, vaping abyssal dark gas he can expel that will absolutely ravage your health before you can even react. You can't get too close to the darkness behind him either, as it has the same effect, so you're waiting for him to slam his arms down and let his rings be vulnerable. Now, in my footage playthrough, I killed him before he could do anything because I felt like flexing, but he does have a ton of slam attacks, can conjure a giant dagger made of light from his rings, he can summon skeletons to aid him in his conquest, and more. I've been trapped in this fight in the past, with him constantly using the giant dagger move over and over and over. If his AI wills it, you will not have a good time. Do you know the meme that's like flirting versus harassment? Wolnir for me is the flirting. When his AI decides you don't get to play, it's cute because he's adorable and an absolute meme lord. But if like Osiris were to do the same thing, that's harassment right there. It even makes me sad when I break his final ring and send him tumbling back into the void. I don't care that he was the conqueror of Carthus or that he sentenced thousands to gruesome deaths so that he could outlive them all. He's my meme lord Wolnir. I can fix him. Perhaps a controversial pick, as I know many people who consider the Crystal Sage to be a bottom 5, if not bottom 3 boss, including my boyfriend, but I want to give props to From Software for at least attempting to create a decent magic fight. The Crystal Sage lies at the end of the Crucifixion Woods ruins and guards the path to the Cathedral of the Deep. This sage allied with the Undead Legion of Farron, ultimately sharing their fate as most of his students went hollow and his mind became obsessed with his sorceries, even dabbling in the corrupted deep magic of the cathedral. As for his boss fight, I don't hate it. The first phase is about getting used to the various magic that the sage can create. You've got classic Soulsborne magic like homing crystal soul masses and soul spears. There's a larger soul crystal mass homing attack that I find very hard to deal with, as it tracks you for quite some time and does a ton of damage. He's got crystal-based ground attacks like good old Seath, or in this game Osiros, and if magic doesn't cover it, a rapier will. It's at half health when this fight takes a turn for the crazy, complete with a disturbingly good music transition as the OST sinks us into the Crystal Sage's obsession with magic. He can summon clones of himself throughout the arena, and your goal is to find the real one. Like with Demon Soul's Fool's Idol though, there's a trick. The real sage will use purple magic, while the clones will use blue magic. So if you spot the real sage quickly, you can get over there and try out damaging his health bar. But that puts players at risk from the clones and their magic, which can be quite overwhelming in certain circumstances. We've all died to this boss before, and chances are it's because we got sloppy and ended up getting magic blasted by 2 clones we ignored because we thought, oh, I can beat that. And since it's still the early game, you don't have a lot of magic defense, so any mistake could be fatal for the player. That's why I feel most people dislike this boss, because it's overwhelming at times and focuses on throwing more magic at the player as opposed to throwing better designed spells to dodge at the player. But it's a shame because the Crystal Sage has a great visual design, some interesting lore, and isn't that bad. But still, I would rather fight most other bosses in the game. Tell me what you guys think of the Crystal Sage in the comments, I'd love to hear it. The first of our Lords of Cinder at number 18, Yorm the Giant. A character who just failed to live up to expectations for me, which is a real shame because if you do some digging, he's one of the most tragic characters in the lore. It's just not expressed in any way through his gameplay, his area, or anything. Once asked to lead a subjugated people to freedom, he became their blade and shield, risking everything in the process. At one point, he befriended Sigvard of Katarina, and they became fast friends, yet Yorm's capital, his kingdom, was not to last. A curse created the profaned flame, which fell from the sky, destroying his city, consuming only those human inhabitants. So Yorm became a Lord of Cinder to put the profaned flame to rest, and gifted a Storm Ruler to Sigvard in case he ever returned, as the Storm Ruler is the only weapon capable of felling a giant. So you and Sigvard, if you followed his questline, arrive at Yorm's chamber and fulfill the promise he made to bring his friend to heal. Which is a lovely sentiment, if it wasn't for the fact that my controller glitched out at the start of the fight, and by the time I got it under control, Yorm had killed Sigvard. I've never been more embarrassed. So, Yorm's boss fight. You can only damage him via the Storm Ruler, a reference to Demon Souls, making this one of the cinematic fights in the same vein as the Storm King, the Divine Dragon from Sekiro, and most recently, Praetor Rykard in Elden Ring. Yet, of all of those types of fights, I'm gonna be honest, this is my least favorite, because we are training this whole game to take down the Lords of Cinder. That is our purpose. But by making this a gimmick fight, we're unable to use any of the equipment or weapons we've built up over the game to bring Yorm to heal. In Elden Ring, this works fine because Rykard's fight is this bombastic, 2-phase, massive moveset battle. And in Demon Souls it works because it was the first of its kind, it was a novel concept. In Dark Souls 3, Yorm just doesn't have the moveset variety to make this feel interesting on a second or third playthrough. Dodges slams, charge the attack, use it, repeat. I also don't like that Yorm has eyes in his embered state, as the Dark Souls 2 giants didn't have those, and neither did Yorm in the opening cutscene. It makes them less intimidating when they have eyes and aren't just a deep black hole. It's not my favorite aesthetic choice. I think because the Abyss Watchers really set the standard for what a Lord of Cinder is earlier in the game, and given we knew that Yhorm was a giant, the expectations were through the roof, and they just couldn't be met. And for me, that's a big sticking point. But once again, even if his fight doesn't hit home, that music though, you've been listening to it. Come on now. Yuka Kitamura, Queen, Slay, Let Loose. So we're at number 17, and I can say with complete confidence that this is the final boss that I have any dislike for in this game. The 16 bosses coming up after Half-Light Spear of the Church are fights I absolutely adore and have far more positives than negatives to talk about. But we have to go through Half-Light first, so the NPC player summoning boss of Dark Souls 3, let's get into it. You either love or hate the gimmick of a player-controlled boss that From Software constantly tried to shoehorn into its games, and it's not a bad idea. If you get a really skilled Half-Light, you can have an epic duel, but in my experience, PvP tends to end rather quickly because there's often a skill disparity, so I prefer to just take my chances with the AI. And then I keep forgetting how hard the Half-Light AI actually is. The fact that you not only have to fight the boss, but also a painting guardian that will respawn at various points in the fight is infuriating. I'd rather just have a fair one-on-one duel, because this AI is more than capable of beating me in a fight and holding its own. Half-Light is like if Genichiro Ashina from Sekiro was in Dark Souls 3. From the way he brings out his bow mid-fight to strike you from afar, to the flurry of sword swings you can't deflect in this game, to the way his magic even has a lightning property like Genichiro. It's really interesting seeing those parallels. But I think Half-Life is so aggressive, yet also so nimble and getting out of the way of my attacks, that I find myself having to run after him constantly in a way that's a little annoying. He just has moves to counter every situation, and if I wasn't so worried that a painting guardian was going to get spawned in to absolutely ruin my day, I'd be more willing to learn the AI fight. My favorite move of his is definitely the Ritual Spear tracking move that follows you through the ground with lightning-tipped spears. It's such a cool visual. This fight is also accompanied by another god-tier OST that you're listening to. The Phase 2 transition once Half-Light arrives is ear candy. That's the best way to describe it. I just think for an NPC, this guy has a little too much stamina in his AI variant that could make it hard to make meaningful progress. But I imagine if I were fighting a player, I could have an entirely different experience. I just simply choose not to, as the online component won't last forever, and for this list, I would rather rank something consistent over something inconsistent. If I were to poll the community on the boss you'd forget about when playing Dark Souls 3, I know the Old Demon King would probably top that list. But this is a rare case where I feel that makes the Old Demon King underrated, because the boss fight is well designed and enjoyable if you fight him before heading to Irithyll. His lore is what it says on the tin. He's an old demon king and one of the last surviving demons in the world, surrounded in his arena by the corpses of his fallen comrades, Capra demons, Taurus demons, and many more. With his species dying out due to the loss of the Chaos Flame, there's nobody left to bury the dead. The demon ruins are slowly being taken over by wildlife, and the skeletons of Karthus are running the ballista on Smoldering Lake to kill any demons who attempt to escape. Those formidable foes from Dark Souls 1, they're now on their last legs. And that's how we find our boss. The fact that when you first attack him, his health bar looks like a normal enemy until he stands up proudly and begins his defense as a boss is so striking, and yet so indicative of his waning power. The creature only has enough strength to fight back against you, but it's almost like kicking a dog when it's down. Swinging his weapon before needing to take a breather, summoning fire attacks that clearly take a toll on his body, while Motoi Sakuraba's work on the OST brings in elements of the Demon and Izalith-based tracks from Dark Souls 1 to create a theme that wholly belongs to the demons. From the frantic violin, the female vocalist in the middle reminding me of the Daughters of Chaos, and just the overall composition making me feel like the music is supposed to be threatening, yet it feels more bark than bite. It captures the essence of this fight perfectly. There's a moment when the old Demon King buffs himself in his second phase and regains some of that old flame from his past, able to now summon meteors you have to run from, and flame rings that expand and contract that are so good to dodge, and explosions that tear the foundations of the... Oh. As his health whittles down, the flames go out, and the old Demon King is just an old man. Making his appearance as one of the best tutorial bosses in the Soulsborne series, Judex Gundyr takes my number 15 spot. When you think about bosses that act as tutorials in FromSoft games, you often think of large towering demons where you swiggity swooty smack that booty. Judex Gundyr completely flips that concept on its head by giving Dark Souls 3 players respect and saying, hey, beat up this fairly difficult opening boss with a complete moveset. I'm gonna save his lore for a future entry in part 2 of my Dark Souls 3 boss rankings for fairly obvious reasons. If you know, you know. If you don't, you'll find out. So let's focus entirely on the boss fight. The arena is stunning, and you approach the frozen Judex pulling the coiled sword from his body to start the battle. His music is one of the best tracks in Dark Souls 3, one of the few that I can remember off the top of my head, showcasing an epic battle theme of orchestral sweeps, setting the tone for the soundtrack to come in perfect fashion. I love how he wields his halberd, as he has a large variety of ways he can swing it to harm you, from thrusts to sweeps, slices and stabs. Yet he's weighty enough that his attacks don't come out fast, giving you time to learn the dodge timings or the shield timings to avoid damage. And I will note that as you dodge him, the game doesn't necessarily punish you for panic dodging. His moveset is very forgiving, which is great for new players. The trick here is to stay close and dodge inwards towards him for most attacks. Alternatively, if you're skilled with his moveset, just dodge where you feel, but either way, it's great getting to have a proper duel with a real knight as a test of whether you're worthy to tackle the rest of the game. Where I suspect players start to struggle is his second phase, where a pus of man bursts forth from his body, and he likely intimidated every player who fought him for the first time. The trick here is that despite his change in appearance, his hitboxes remain relatively the same. Stay close to him, stay underneath him, dodge when you can, and beware of his jump attack, as the timing is just slower than you might think to avoid. The worst thing you can do is dodge outwards in this phase, because that's when his pus of man slams will catch you off guard. You just have to have confidence against Judex and you will succeed. I remember my first playthrough when I took him down. I wasn't a big fan of his transformation, and I wished I could fight him again, but without that caveat. Little did I know, the game agreed. If I were ranking these bosses based on pop culture influence, Vort of the Boreal Valley would be my number 1, because whether you realized it or not, Vort's soundtrack is the most famous Dark Souls 3 track of all time. And it's probably up there as one of the most famous tracks in the entirety of Soulsborne. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Vort of the Boreal Valley is a perfect second boss. It introduces you to a new element of Dark Souls 3, being the Frostbite status effect, and acts as a completely different type of boss to Judex Gundyr, feeling more like a traditional quadrupedal beast boss than the former. And I do consider Vort to be a tutorial boss in the same way I consider the High Wall of Lothric to be the true tutorial area of Dark Souls 3. The flow of his fight is similar to Osiros, where his first phase is more calculated and hesitant, swinging his mace and trying to knock you over while you roll around to his back and start smacking that booty. He's not a hard fight, far from it, but he doesn't need to be. And as you begin whittling his health down, you're thinking, It's pretty simple. And then he hits half health.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
Vort's Phase 2 is the equivalent of why do I hear boss music, because holy shit, even though the fight is easy and his 3 massive charges are simple to avoid, it still leaves one hell of an impression on you as you're suddenly hearing the music blaring in your ears, this creature roaring as he powers up. Frost breath coming from his mouth as he tries to freeze you to the bone, which also happens to be his most vulnerable moment. If Udex Gundyr teaches the player to be patient and observant, Vort of the Boreal Valley is designed to teach players to trust in their instincts. You can avoid those charges, and doing so will give you a massive opening to punish. You just have to trust that you know when to dodge, and 9 times out of 10, your instincts will be correct. Combined with the best music track in Dark Souls 3, of course composed by my man Motoi Sakuraba, and you have a fight that stays memorable to you, even if you melt the boss very quickly. It's a shame his fight is generally so easy, because if it was tougher, if it was a late game fight, if he had a few more moves, he would have felt more like Ludwig than a cleric beast. He could have been one of my top 5 in that case. But as it stands, number 14. If I had a nickel for Soulsborne bosses that want to devour the very gods, I'd have 2 nickels. That's not a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Rykard Elden Ring's predecessor, Aldrich Devourer of Gods, rounds out the final spot on today's video. For those of you that don't know, I tend to pick one character from these games to get excited about. In Dark Souls 1, it was Nito, Dark Souls 2, it was the Old Iron King, and from the moment I saw the opening of Dark Souls 3, I was so curious about Aldrich. Yet I couldn't have expected what I saw when I walked into his boss room. The man truly is the Devourer of Gods, wielding the tip of Nito's Gravelord sword, able to use Priscilla's Life Hunt scythe, and perhaps most damningly of all, is controlling the optional femboy of the Souls series, Gwendolyn, like a puppet on a string, even to the point of his boss theme being a bastardized version of Gwendolyn's theme in Dark Souls, and yes, it's a banger. Battling him in the remains of the ruins of the Anor Londo Cathedral is one thing, seeing that the pillars still protect from certain attacks, legends never die. Aldrich's lore as a Lord of Cinder is so fascinating. He effectively runs a cult and gained his status through ever-growing power as a holy cleric, leading to him becoming the twisted creature he is today. Who would have thought we'd finally see the slime enemies have a boss represent them? I didn't. His boss fight though is polarizing because yes, it's another magic fight. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that Soulsborne players only like magic when they're the ones using it. Most of Aldrich's attacks are fine, soul spears are nothing new at this point, the homing soul masses can be blocked via the pillars, even broken ones, and his scythe spin is easy to roll through. The only attack that puts this fight into frustrating territory for new players, myself included back in the day, is his arrow barrage. In Phase 1, the arrows will spread out in a cone in the direction of the player, which you can avoid by just getting to the other side of Aldrich. But in his Embered Phase 2, the arrows will follow the player around the room, getting closer and closer, and if you don't have the stamina to outrun them, game over. While I've gotten used to that attack over the years, I totally agree that it's just not fun to handle. Homing attacks in Soulsborne games rarely feel fun to deal with, and when it's a barrage of arrows that will kill you if they get to you, yeah, it can suck. But Aldrich's insane amount of lore that I just can't touch in this video, VartiVidya can explain it better, as well as the build-up and the surprisingly good magic fight against him, has me putting him this high. Thank you everyone for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm so excited for next week's video. You have no idea how much I adore the 12 bosses coming up. Between Aldrich and my number 12 spot, there's like a gigantic gap in quality. That being said, if you want to keep up to date with my videos, be sure to parry that subscribe button, leave a like, and maybe comment down below. That would certainly help out. My socials are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon who have supported me for yet another month. You guys are awesome, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week. Adios.